Hi everybody, it's Mark, the Family Woodworker. This week we make some amazing cherry and walnut tabletop accent lights with a couple of disasters along the way. Stick with us to see the awesome outcome. It's a disaster. To start, I wanted to use thicker, clear hardwood stock and found a nice piece of local cherry wood along with a darker and mostly clear grain black walnut because, why just make one piece of art when you can make two and give one as a gift? I cross-cut some 5-inch blocks from both the cherry and then the walnut stock, and then I set up my rip fence for half-inch cuts. I also switched over to a new 60-tooth trim blade for clean cuts on those small pieces. But I know what you're thinking. You're diving in without a plan?
Okay, look, I think I have a plan here.
I wanted to embrace that staggered cubism design using half-inch blocks in a 4x4-inch base, 6.47 inches in height, where the center will then be filled with tinted epoxy. The 4x6.47-inch dimensions will fit the golden ratio.
Okay, we're doing the golden ratio.
The golden ratio.
The golden ratio.
Yeah, it's one of those things I didn't pay much attention to back in high school math class, but it's seen everywhere in nature, in the art world, and in architecture. That ratio is 1 to 1.618, and that will govern my final project dimensions. At this point, for each type of wood, it was all about trying to get 128 perfectly cut half-inch by half-inch rectangular blocks so that when I stacked them all together, they would fit tightly and squarely as I glued them up. This is the point in the video where you can openly laugh at me because tiny width cuts, no matter how perfect you think you make them, are always going to be off by a hair. Sometimes you press down too hard on the push stick or the wood walks away slightly from the fence. But hey, that's what sandpaper and chisels are for during assembly, right? Because right now they look perfectly symmetrical and well behaved. My plan was to cut a bunch of different lengths so that I could arrange the blocks in a cascading waterfall pattern from one corner to the opposing corner. They ranged in lengths from 2 3/4 inches to a half-inch. The larger pieces would form the base and the smaller pieces would be used for the top of the piece. The gap in between the top and bottom would be filled with a new epoxy that I'm going to try. But I'm getting ahead of myself and the problems I encountered there. For now, let's just make some cuts and then get creative with the arrangement of the blocks. this point in the project, you might be asking, was this an easy project so far? The t-shirt really says it all, and things were about to get worse. Knowing I had to do an expensive epoxy pour, I spent the extra money to buy a new tool to help remove bubbles from the epoxy and to make it as clear as glass. A vacuum chamber like this one is also good for infusing epoxy into soft or damaged wood in order to harden and stabilize it. You can see my unsponsored tool review for this particular guy at the card link above. In preparation for the pour, I built up my box forms with this melamine shelf material, gluing the forms together and sealing the backsides of each joint with some more hot glue. A thin top plate and some hold-down screws would help keep the blocks from floating or moving, and then it was ready for the vacuum chamber. I actually think two things contributed to the nightmare I was about to experience. First, I should have never tried using a new tool like this for the first time on an expensive wood and epoxy pour. I grossly underestimated the amount of outgassing I would get from a dense hardwood like walnut. But I expected that it would subside and the epoxy would settle out as the bubbles rose to the top. Second, I used some old leftover marine epoxy from my canoe build a few years ago. This stuff normally has a slow cure time and a long pot life, or at least it's supposed to. I guess not. It was a disaster. And the project is a throwaway. Well, maybe it's just time to call it quits.
Now, how do you think, fella? I keep playing. I don't think the heavy stuff's going to come down for quite a while.
So let's just recap where we are. I think the wood block design is a winner, and the epoxy forms actually worked really well. But the marine epoxy, on the other hand, it's just not right for this project. And as for the vacuum chamber, it worked great, but pulled too much gas from the wood. Finally, it was only the walnut blocks that I ruined, and the cherry is still ready to go. So what do we do now?
Figure it out. Figure it out. Figure it out.
Figure it out.
First, I had to find an epoxy with a slower pot time that would actually allow the bubbles to rise out of the casting. I found one with decent reviews, and my first test with this pine cone actually came out pretty awesome. No visible bubbles inside the block with this slow cure time. I also had to recreate the walnut pieces and glue those blocks back together for another try. So let's, figure it out. There's no point in showing the rebuild of the walnut blocks, but it followed the same basic design as the first epoxy disaster. In order to help eliminate the possibility of stray bubbles forming during the next pour, I decided to seal up any cracks or tiny gaps between the blocks with some thicker epoxy and a boat-building epoxy syringe. After that initial application had cured, I followed that up by brushing on some of the new clear craft epoxy to cover all the end grain on the top and the bottom pieces, including inside the battery box chamber. Because the new craft epoxy had a reputation for a slow cure time and good feedback about allowing bubbles to rise out of the casting before it cured, I chose to skip the vacuum chamber for the final pour on both sculptures. With me and some guy that looks like me finishing the construction of another set of epoxy forms, they should allow for a slightly wider and longer set of cured dimensions so that I can sand the finished piece back to that 4 by 6.47 inch perfect ratio. To finish the prep of the box form, I wipe them down with some butcher block conditioner. Now that sounds appropriately weird, but the mixture of mineral oil and beeswax does a really nice job as a release agent for an epoxy pour. You'll just have to trust me on this. Mixing up separate batches of the new epoxy, I took some care not to stir the mixture too vigorously. It took longer to get the two chemicals to mix thoroughly, but the slow mixing helped to eliminate tons of the bubbles I was trying to avoid. To add a little bit of color and bring some swirling characteristics to the pour, I added a little bit of white mica powder, which adds some shimmer to the mix. Too much would have made the pour opaque, but adding just a little bit added some tint while still allowing you to see through the block. I also thought the shimmer might catch some of that light that will introduce through the bottom. I poured the mixture slowly on an angle so that it would naturally fill in the voids between the blocks. This stuff is pretty thick anyway. It's like watching someone try to pour refrigerated honey from a glass jar. Part of you wants it to go faster, but as far as epoxy goes, slower is going to mean fewer trapped air pockets. Finishing up both pours, the seams on the form seemed to be holding without any leaks, but I still took some precaution with a silicone mat on my work table to catch any oops leaks. Time to let it sit overnight. The next day was the scary and exciting part of the project, involving a hammer and a pry bar and potentially some homemade explosives to release the beast from its cage.
Release the Kraken!
Despite the expected drama, the woodblock sculptures actually released from the forms pretty cleanly. I can see a couple obvious bubble inclusions in the walnut pour, but the cherry wood piece actually looks pretty clean. The bandsaw will help remove the overpour and get me closer to the wood for final finishing. And then it's off to about a day of sanding through the grits. I had purchased these 9-volt LED lights and the switched battery boxes separately, meaning that I needed to splice the two pieces together. The box allows me to mount the battery on the inside of the light, and it already has a switch on it, so the LED corded switch can go. This was just a little cut, strip, solder test, and then I could install the bulb and the battery box into each block. Some hot glue will hold the box down in the base and still allow you to slide it open to change the battery. A little more glue will hold the bulb down on the inside of the drilled hole, and then a small wire clip will hold everything else in place. I also had some leftover reclaimed leather material, and I'll use that to make a custom pad on the bottom of each light so that it won't scratch any table you choose to place the light on. I traced out the shape and proceeded to cut the open leather square for the base of each light. Double-faced tape will hold the leather in place, but still allow for removal or replacement if ever needed. In the end, the tea lights or votive lights or accent lights or whatever you choose to call them turned out pretty cool. I always like to try things that I've never done before and enjoy the whole learning experience of it all. Even considering the struggle with the epoxy, I really like how these turned out, and I think I'll improve some of my techniques on another style of light like this in the future. They look pretty awesome in a dark room, or as accent lights for an evening get-together. Hey everybody, thanks very much for sticking around till the end. I'd really appreciate a thumbs up for our video and hope you choose to subscribe to our channel. Stay frosty.